Hello and welcome to the Young Texas and Reformed podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto, and in this episode we are going to be looking at the Reformed Sage Facebook group, or page. I think they sell tumblers and shirts and stuff. I don't know who runs it, but I'm sure they're good people. But there have been three posts lately about King James Version onlyism, and I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of talk about what King James onlyism is, what it isn't, and how sort of the conversation happens around it. I'm always talking about, the sort of typical critical text perspective of the King James Version, but I think that these posts, I can actually show you guys what I'm talking about here. So we're gonna take a look. There was three posts, mostly lighthearted, kind of like sort of poking fun at the fact that the King James is more proper, which I actually think is a kind of a compliment, but. So this post in particular, when someone whips out a modern translation during a Bible study, King James Version only people, it's sort of like I'm scared. And this is kind of in line with, some of their other posts. Let's see here. I think this is the other one. KJV only boys showing up to the Bible study. So the Reformed Sage itself seems to be taking sort of a lighthearted approach. So I'm going to be lighthearted towards the Reformed Sage. I think it's only fair. And that thread mostly kind of, friendly jabbing. But in this post right here, it gets a little bit brutal. So, for example, Andy Kane here says, sadly, this is not a joke. So he takes a look at it and says, this isn't funny. As a former militant onlyist, this is what you are brainwashed into. Okay, so we already have kind of a first look at one perspective that King James onlyism is the result of brainwashing. Then the next comment, King James Version onlyism is like a cult. Okay, so you have brainwashing, cult, and there's a sub comment here. Steven Anderson is the Charles Manson of IFB and King James Version onlyist. 2 likes. Let's see. We have Joshua Henderson and Russell Lundy. Seem to think it's okay to compare Steven Anderson with a cult leader who was responsible for the murder of a number of people who wanted to start a race war in the United States. So that's where we are so far in the thread. Then you have some sort of lighthearted banter here from Nick Sayers. And then I kind of jump in and say, seeing the cult language and seeing this, I'm like, you know what, this is not cool with me. Why is it that people who haven't read any Reformed theologians always hate the KJV? And this actually seems like, well received. You go on and you read, there's no hate of the KJV here. And then another comment which says, I guess this is the comment I want to focus in on. So before we get to this comment, let's take a few notes. The general perception, as we sort of see on this thread, is that King James Version onlyism is like it's brainwashing, it's a cult. People who advocate for it are like Charles Manson. So this is sort of the perspective on the ground that we're seeing here. And again, doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the Reformed Sage, just I think the sort of cult brainwashy sort of language is pretty typical of a thread like this. I've seen it all over the place, so it should be addressed. So in the first place, let's take a look at how we're defining King James Version onlyism. So if we just kind of take the thread and say, okay, let's just say Steven Anderson epitomizes the KJV only position. Well, Steven Anderson doesn't believe in double inspiration, re-inspiration. He thinks that there are other versions that can be read in other languages that are faithful translations to the TR. In fact, he does his daily devotions from the Hebrew and the Greek. So he reads Spanish, German, all sorts of other languages for his Bible. So what that tells us is that if we're going to depict the King James Version only position as the way that Steven Anderson represents it, then we're not assuming Ruckmanism. We're not assuming Gipp or Ripplinger. We're assuming basically the position that the traditional text, the Hebrew Masoretic text, and the Greek received text are the preserved text. That's what Steven Anderson believes, and that the King James Version is the best English translation of those texts and therefore should be used, seeing as there isn't a better translation. That's Stephen Anderson's position. So if that's King James onlyism, that's essentially any person that actually just reads the King James. That's why they do it. So that's how we're defining King James onlyism here in this thread. Now, further, if we take it out a level and look at, like, James White, Mark Ward, Andrew Naselli, then we're defining King James onlyism kind of branded as a majority text position. We're looking at people that read the NKJV. We're looking at people that just prefer the King James version, and as well as the Ruckmanites and the re-inspiration, double inspiration kind of folks. So that's our big broad bucket that we're using to describe King James Version onlyism, including a very moderate position. So now let's read this comment by a gentleman by the name of Scott McClare, who has a South Park image with a beer in hand. So this is who we're dealing with here. So I guess you didn't bother reading the thread or the post. So the post itself was kind of not like a big deal. It wasn't actually saying anything, really. It was just kind of making a fun little lighthearted jab. And the thread, I did read the thread. We saw that that KJV-onlyism is the product of brainwashing. It's like a cult. That those that kind of advocate for it are like Charles Manson. So that's what the thread said, as we've read it up to this comment. There's no KJV hate going on at all. There's a deserved jab at the King James Version only superstition. So here we go. Add another descriptor. It's a superstition. And I think you probably got that language from Mark Ward or James White. They use that language pretty often to describe it. It's just polemics. He goes on, but King James Version onlyists have a blind spot when it comes to drawing a necessary distinction between foolish ideas, so now it's foolish, about the King James Version and the KJV itself. So we have this distinction now, what we think about the KJV versus the King James Version itself. So in theory, there is a distinction to be made, what the King James Version is versus what people think about it. And I agree with that distinction. Obviously, that's true with any object and subject relationship. There's the sun, and then there's what I think about the sun. There are puppies and what I think about puppies. So really nothing groundbreaking so far said. You attack the former, so I think he's talking about sort of himself here. You attack the former, and they assume you're attacking the latter. So if you attack, what people think about the KJV, the assumption is that you're actually attacking the King James Version itself. And while the point is true, I think he would have to demonstrate that that's not what's going on, right? So there's a difference between, like, saying that, the King James Version, we're not hating it, right? And we're just attacking the people that read it and calling them cultists, brainwashed, like Charles Manson. So that's a level of intensity, I think, that we have to examine. So he goes on and says, it's irrational. So now King James Version onlyism is irrational. It's foolish. And in the 30 years since I first heard of King James Version onlyism, they still haven't learned. And he doesn't say what it is that we haven't learned. So I say that's a lot of words to say that you don't like the KJV. And I'm just kind of being a little bit, like, non-engaging. And he goes on and says, you don't like the KJV. That's a roundabout way of admitting I'm right about King James Version onlyism, confusing King James Version onlyism with the KJV itself. So if you're still with me, I want to make a case for why attacking King James Version onlyism is the same effectively and practically as attacking the King James Version. So argumentatively, that's too many T's. Logically, there we go. He's right. Categorically, they're two different things, right? But there's a bridge between the two, and we need to examine the bridge. And that bridge is the why. So why is King James Version onlyism wrong? So if we take sort of the double re-inspiration or the double inspiration or re-inspiration view, I agree. That's wrong, right? The Reformed position, the confessional position, is that the original Hebrew and Greek were immediately inspired by God through the writers, and that those texts were providentially preserved. They were kept pure in all ages, and that's how we have the scriptures. That's how they're infallible. And so if you were to say that a translation was more authoritative than the original immediately inspired texts, you would be in error, like the critical text group does with the Septuagint, for example. Same with the Ruckmanites, right? They do the same thing. So if we're defining King James onlyism as that, sure, I'll agree with you, right? That's foolish, that's irrational, so on and so forth. But if we're taking Stephen Anderson's view as sort of the Charles Manson, the leader, the cult leader of the King James Version only movement, then we're not talking about that kind of King James onlyism. We're talking about a view that says the Hebrew and the Greek, the immediately inspired texts that were originally set forth, were kept pure in all ages, and that the King James Version is the best available English translation of those texts. This view allows for other languages to be used, where proper King James Version onlyism would only be allowable if there was a proper translation of the King James, or perhaps only the King James. So again, we're not in heretical land right now. We're not in the foolish land right now. So there is a connection. Why is there a connection? Because ultimately, the reason that people say that King James onlyism so-called is foolish is because they're still reading the King James Version exclusively. Right. The problem is that if you reject modern versions, then you're a fool. Then you're ignorant. So it fundamentally comes down to the textual discussion and not King James Version onlyism. Right. The reason people read the King James Version, there's a number of them. Joel Beakey gives, I think, like 10 or 8 or something like that. That the different kind of diverse reasons that people read the King James Version. Among these are they like the sound of it, they think it's a beautiful translation, it's translated from the best textual data, it has a rich history, it's not changing. I mean, there's a number of reasons that you could read the King James Version other than King James Version onlyism from like a double inspiration perspective or a re-inspiration perspective. But we've already established that we're not actually talking about the double inspiration view here. And we never are. That's as a side note, what people need to recognize is that when someone attacks King James Version onlyism, they're not usually talking about the Ruckman, Gipp, Ripplinger kind of idea. They're usually talking about people who just only read the King James Version. But if that's our category, right, the onlyist kind of idea, well, what do we do with the people that only read an ESV or only read translations of the modern critical text? They are the same kind of onlyist, that's just with a different Bible. They're only reading a certain Bible from a certain text. So the problem is not onlyism. In fact, I think onlyism makes the most sense in terms of a Bible translation or a Bible text, right? I only think that this is the Bible that should be used. You have a number of people in the modern critical text side that believe that, especially when it comes to like the NASB, for example. So onlyism is not the problem, and Ruckmanism is not the problem, allegedly. So what's the problem? And that's why we have to answer this question: why? Why is it that attacking so-called King James onlyism is attacking the King James? Because the why is basically one of two reasons. The first, the English is too hard, in which case you're actually just attacking the King James. You're saying the King James is too hard to read and shouldn't be used. So that is, in a way, an attack on the King James Version. And the two is that it's based on bad textual data. And if you're going to say that people who think the modern critical text is an errant text, is a bad text, if you think that idea is foolish, well, then you actually have to go to bat. You have to argue for why the modern critical text is more authoritative. And seeing that the modern textual methodology says nothing about authoritativeness, there's not really an argument to be made there now, is there? So what we need to learn from this is that modern so-called reform people are very quick to call people cultists, Charles Manson, foolish, irrational, brainwashed, for simply disagreeing on the textual criticism issue. You know, you could go into the modern critical text history and like actually identify cultists that were involved in creating the modern critical text. That's far more valid than calling a KJV-onlyist so-called occultist. But here's the problem, is that this person right here, this Scott McClare, thinks that he's sort of done some sort of mic drop moment, but he hasn't actually said anything. He hasn't shown me what KJV-onlyists still haven't learned. And he goes on and says that's a roundabout way of admitting I'm right about King James Version onlyist, confusing KJV-onlyism with the KJV itself. So the problem is that if King James onlyism is a problem, if I were to say I'm not a King James onlyist, I just read the KJV, would he be okay with that? Would he be okay with that? And in the end, no, he would not be okay with that. Because categorically, there's no difference between their version of King James Version onlyist and the person that says, I just like the KJV. In fact, in James White's book, that's one of the examples of a King James Version onlyist. So no matter how you try to nuance this conversation, no matter how charitable you try to be, ultimately it comes down to, why are you reading a King James Version? And to them, there is no good reason for it. To them, it's foolishness, it's irrational, it's cult-like, it's a brainwashed position. People who advocate it for it, like Steven Anderson, are the Charles Manson of the IFB. You know, there's no winning. There's no win. And that's what I wanted to show in this thread. Because, you could take a look at the English argument and quickly, put two and two together that, 7th and 8th graders in our public school system read Shakespeare, learn Shakespeare, study Shakespeare a little bit. And yet you have full-grown, learned adults that are saying it's too hard. Well, why are we letting our kids learn Shakespeare if it's unintelligible, if it's too hard? What's the profit in it? So there's when it comes down to it, it's just a problem with the King James Version. Right? I think what would be an interesting question for these types to answer is, okay, well, if you don't have a problem with the actual KJV, why do you have a problem with King James Version onlyism? If the KJV is a perfectly fine translation, if it's serviceable, if it gets the job done, if it's inerrant, what's wrong with somebody only reading it? And that's a big question that I don't think a lot of people have really thought about all that much. Because when it comes down to it, I think, the problem is just with the King James Version. It disagrees with the modern idea of what the Bible is. It doesn't change year by year. It serves a serious problem for the so-called progress of the academy. And so we have a severe issue, a disconnect. And this is my conclusion. We've seen that there's definitely a confusion as to what King James Version onlyism is in this thread. Because you have people calling it cult-like, you have people calling it like brainwashing, Charles Manson's name is thrown around casually. I think that demonstrates there's a severe disconnect when it comes to how people are defining King James Version onlyism. And then we kind of see how the argument unfolds. Ultimately, it's always about the King James Version. Why would King James onlyism be a problem if the problem wasn't the King James? Because at that point, you're just thought policing. Like, you can read the King James, but you can't think that it's the best Bible. Well, then why would I read the King James if I don't think it's the best one available? What other reason would I read the KJV if I don't think it's the best? Me personally, at least, that's why I read it. So, this is the kind of argumentation you're going to see out there. And we can maybe take a look at a couple more. So this guy tries to make my point. He says, I'm not a King James Version only person, but it is my main Bible. I like your stuff, but all this KJV bashing is ridiculous. I would take a literal translation over a dynamic equivalent, or God forbid, a free translation any day. You know, this is just the average person that reads the King James Version. He's like, I'm not a King James onlyist. I, I just think it's the best one out there. And let's just see what we get in response. Um, yeah, sir, once again, the point is the cultic onlyism. Most of us who are against onlyism still have copies of the KJV in our homes. Why would the fact that someone exclusively uses the KJV bother you, seeing as you have the version yourself would lend some credence to its validity and usefulness? The only type of onlyism I am against is the kind that would force everyone else to use it. And then this guy says, stop being purposely dense. You know full well there are people that say the KJV is the only... So here we go. Like, this guy takes a perfectly agreeable position, and yet someone's still trying to argue against him. There's no response here. One day later, but this idea that like King James Version onlyists are trying to make everyone else read the KJV, I think it's a little disconnected. I think there's a group of people that do that, typically the Ruckmanites, but we've already established we're not talking about the Ruckmanites. I would like for people to read the King James Version. I think it's the best translation. Just like the modern critical text, people would like me to read a number of their translations. That's the essential discussion. So with that, I think that I think in this second conversation, we sort of see, I think, a very moderate discussion going on. And then above, we see sort of the extreme of the discussion, where people kind of jump to saying cults, brainwash, irrational, foolish. This seems to be more of the moderate version of that conversation. So there you have it. You saw kind of an extreme version of the conversation. You saw a moderate version of the conversation. And I think that kind of is helpful. Hopefully that's helpful for you guys just to see what people are saying out there. And with that, I think I'm going to call this video closed. Thanks for watching. This has been the Young Texas and Reformed podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. May the Lord bless you and keep you. And we will see you all in the next episode.